Struggle of young people in 1976 rising up against the apartheid government. Those struggles have changed for young people, but nonetheless challenges remain. Well, as the country observes Youth Month, we're looking back tonight to the rise of things like the Fees Must Fall movement. That student-led movement resulted in thousands of university students across South Africa marching and taking their fight to the seat of power in Pretoria. Their aim was to advocate against the rise in tertiary student fees and put pressure on government to increase funding for institutions of higher learning. Now, SABC News brings you this special panel discussion live tonight. Let's take you there.
Hello. Hello, thank you so much for joining us on this Youth Day. We've got a really interesting lineup of young students, young activists who are involved in various youth struggles. So the topic that we're talking about today is we want to unpack and deal with, youth struggles since 1976. We want to focus particularly on education, we want to focus particularly on racism in education. One of the biggest questions we're asking is decolonized education and a decolonized curriculum the solution to the school racism that we keep seeing coming up over and over again? And I want to start this panel by introducing you to the people that we have on the line. We have Ntokozo Kwabe, who is one of the leading voices in Roads Must Fall, but also in Fees Must Fall, both at UCT and at Oxford University. We have Belani Ludidi, who was a Fees Must Fall activist at CPUT at the time, who's also a journalist right now. We have Emanuela, who's a young activist who has been taking us through what happened to young people, or what happens to young people at private schools in South Africa, and has been really, changing things, or rather shaking things up with her petition against institutionalized racism at her former school. And then we also have on the line Rabia, who was part of Open Stellenbosch, and she used art and also can give us a lot of insight into what was done in order for Stellenbosch to change and no longer be a university that uses only Afrikaans, in its institution. And then we also have, last but not least, Funzani, who is one of the leading female voices, who's also a feminist economist right now, but was one of the leading voices in Fees Must Fall, and was based at UJ during Fees Must Fall. So thank you so much, guys, for joining us today. I'm so excited to have everybody at home listening to us and listening to what we have today. The first question that I want to ask, and this is the question that many people have asked me as I talk to schools who are trying to put together plans for diversity, as I talk to just people in general: what is racism? And why is it that we keep having this conversation about racism? And I'm going to start with you, Emmanuel. Can you tell us what is racism, and why are you against racism at an institutional level, and what it is that this current crop of young people who are fighting schools about racism want people to know?
Okay, thank you so much for having me, Asanda. I think the definition of racism is very simple. It's prejudice, discrimination, or even antagonism against a marginalized group just for their being of a particular ethnicity or a particular race, right? So that's just the broad definition of what racism is. And then at an institutional level, institutional racism can be defined as prejudice or discrimination that have become normal practice in a particular organization or at a particular institution. So just a quick fire example of what an example of institutionalized racism would be at a school is if the code of conduct says that you cannot wear your afro out. That is a normalized part of the institution, and that's how racism is displayed that way institutionally. So I think that's just a very simple way of defining the two concepts. And why students are in uproar is because, racism, discrimination of any kind really cannot continue. And so we cannot just be comfortable with the status quo being what it is. And if we see an injustice, we have to call it out. And that's why students have really taken this time to stand up and speak up for what's right.
Okay, and what exactly is it that the current crop of activists are calling for? Because I think people know what people in 76 were calling for. They have a bit of a sense of what people in Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall were calling for. But what is this current crop of activists calling for particularly?
Okay. Just broadly, it's calling for an end to institutionalized racism. And I've briefly explained what that is. But how that's reflected, it reflects itself in different ways across different institutions. So I know that a lot of different schools, students in schools have been drafting with a list of demands that they want, because that's how racism is manifested in their particular institution. And those are the steps that need to be taken in order for racism to be eradicated. So just in my example, we've been calling for change in hair policy. We've been calling for a decolonization of the curriculum. We have been calling for more representation in terms of staff members. We've been calling for freedom for people of color to speak their languages on the school premises. So in our particular context, that's what we're calling for. Broadly, it's institutionalized racism that it needs to come to an end. But again, that looks different from school to school.
Okay, thank you so much for explaining that. So we're now going to go to Ntokozo Kwabe. Ntokozo, you were part of Roads Must Fall at Oxford University, and you called for a number of statues to be toppled. And it looks like, you know, Black Lives Matter somehow just made this thing happen for you, that it was so difficult for you at the time to make happen. What do you think about that? And what is it that you guys wanted? And do you feel that some of it has been achieved by the toppling of the statue and throwing it into Thames that happened?
Thank you so much, Sis Asanda, for having me. And thank you for to all those who are tuning in. So I think a nice place to begin would be perhaps to say that, yes, of course, it feels good to see some of these dinosaur statues fall, because that's exactly what we called for. But it also feels, in a sense, bittersweet, because now we see a lot of institutions that would otherwise not be, or that were not in support of the kind of projects that we're pushing, now sort of joining and purporting to be pushing this anti-racist agenda because it seems fashionable to do so. And these institutions are saying that they are against racism, but they are not saying exactly what role they are playing in terms of the actual actions that they are taking within those institutions to make sure that they push the program that we called for, the program of decolonization. Now, Asanda, I need to point out that the hard work still lies ahead. Statues can be moved, and we pointed this out a number of times during Fees Must Fall, during Roads Must Fall, that what we were calling for, yes, is a reconfiguration of the space, which is where iconography sort of comes in. But the conversation was broader than just iconography. The conversation was always about the decolonizing the entire university, be it the curriculum, as you've correctly pointed out, be it increasing the representation of Black people within the university space, be it increasing representation of even the Black student body, which is something that is remarkable, you know, that there are universities like UCT, for example, where Black people remain a minority, or at the very least, were still a minority in 2016. So there's a broad program of decolonization that we proposed to the universities and to the various institutions. And we said, take this program and implement. And just because now it's become fashionable that statues are coming down, it's not enough. It's not gonna get it done. People need to know that there is still a lot of work to do to decolonize these institutions. But also, I think it's important to point out that, like the 1976 generation, we saw our struggle in 2015, 2016 as being broader than just the university space. It was about the place of Blackness and of Black people in South African society today, knowing that in 1994, there was a promise, you know, that now Black people are free, that right, we are in a rainbow nation, that everything is fine, and that we can now move on and all live happily ever after in a society that is equal and that cares about us all. But of course, going through these institutions, we then realized that this was a lie. We realized that there were no people who looked like us who were professors. There was one Black South African professor at UCT at that time. 20 odd years later, one Black professor. So it's those things that we started encountering. We started seeing that the curriculum doesn't represent us and our voices, and that it actually doesn't speak to our problems as Africans. And there are many various examples that I will sort of refer to as we get into the curriculum discussion, because I think it's a very important one, where you just see that the actual curriculum that's offered in many different areas, both at university and at high school level, is a curriculum that just doesn't address our problems, and that is pretty much irrelevant, really, and that we shouldn't be prescribing, at these various levels. So, Asanda, just to conclude, I think it is important to recognize that there was a broader system that we were challenging, that like the 1976 generation, who, by the way, were not just fighting a struggle about Afrikaans, but they were basically pushing back against the illegitimate power structure of the apartheid government as a white minority that had imposed itself on the African people. And that merely manifested at that time in the language policy that said that students must study in Afrikaans. In our case, right, we have pointed out that yes, South Africa is said to be a democracy, but there are lingering questions from 1994 which call into question the entire system, where Black people are still in the margins. We experience that through our location in the universities in the form of the various issues that we are pointing out in the universities, but these are questions that are about Blackness generally and the plight of Black people under a South Africa that purports to be a democracy, but whose institutions have not really been decolonized to speak to the interests of Black people.
Okay, thank you, Ntokozo. We'll just leave it there for now. Can you just take us through, Funzani, you were part of Fees Must Fall, which was a relative, a cousin, interrelated to Rhodes Must Fall. Can you just explain to us the relationship between Fees Must Fall and Rhodes Must Fall? Because I think a lot of people don't understand it. And what is it that, the students of that time were calling for? And what has happened since, if anything? And what do you think, this moment or that moment of Fees Must Fall connects or was able to tell us about what happened and what is going to happen in the future?
Yeah. Thank you, Asanda, for having me on the show. Well, just to start, I think it's quite important to actually understand the context in which all these must fall movements are actually happening, right? And when it comes to Rhodes Must Fall was essentially kind of, I think it was more a very, for me at least, a symbolic kind of action more than it was anything else. Symbolic in the sense that it was youth, right? Young people who were actually questioning why we should still have these statues erected in our universities and why we actually still have these statues erected anyway, really, to be quite honest, right? And they were not only questioning the statues themselves, but it was more like a thing of, okay, so what does this actually mean? What does, when we say decolonization, what does decolonization actually means in the context in which we exist in, right? Where we know that Black people still very much remain marginalized in the country. And so it was more, yes, a call towards decolonization, but also a question of why is it that Black people still find themselves in marginalized positions, right? And not only just socially, but also economically and culturally and traditionally, right? And I mean, you look at the fact that Fees Must Fall was actually happening in other universities, right? In smaller universities like your TUTs, your VUTs, even way before Rhodes Must Fall itself. And then when Rhodes Must Fall came into being, it became this moment in which, like a bigger moment than actually students having been protesting in those traditionally Black universities against the fees, right? And you have to actually appreciate the fact that Rhodes Must Fall became what it was because it was happening particularly at UCT. And that on itself spoke volumes in terms of our understanding of our society, because it said, well, the voices at UCT are quite important than the voices of students in historically Black universities. Like
you said it was a class issue?
Yes. So I'd actually even go into that and say that, it was a class issue. It spoke to the fact that economically, and I mean, UCT is considered as this, number one university in Africa. But then when you actually look at it, you'd actually find that there were moments of protest that were happening in historically Black universities, but they were not recognized as an important moment because of the fact that, they're historically Black. Right?
Yes.
And I was at UJ when Fees Must Fall started. And I mean, UJ is seen as a predominantly Black university, and there's a lot of Black people there. But you have to understand how racism and white supremacy and oppression actually operates and find and manifest itself, because I don't necessarily think that we can reduce white supremacy to the existence of white people in the university. But we have to actually understand it, that it's a whiteness and white oppression is a spirit, some kind of a spirit, because it still exists even in the townships, right? Where you're not necessarily finding white people. And the reason why I say that it's a spirit is because even in the way we interact with each other as Blacks, right? It's very much based on on our notions and understandings of what white supremacy wants us to understand ourselves. Right.
Okay. Thank you, Funzani. Sorry to cut you off, but I just want to take this a little bit forward, and I want to talk about, this issue of language, this issue of representation, and I want to bring in Rabia to this conversation, because she can talk us through, why was language such an important issue for Open Stellenbosch during Rhodes Must Fall and during Fees Must Fall, and I also want to bring in, Velani, who can talk us through the role of the media and how the media used, didn't use, was propaganda, was not propaganda, and represented people during the struggles. But I want to start with you, Rabia. Can you tell us a little bit about, what role did language play, and why was language very important? And also, I think, just touch a little bit on how you guys use art, which is quite an interesting one. Like, how did you use art for protest, and why was that so important to you, that you weren't just talking but you were also creating in this moment of chaos?
So thank you very much. It's a very important question. So with the case of Stellenbosch, initially it was a question of how are students excluded from the university experience? And while that happens on a basis of race, it also happens through language at Stellenbosch University. And so that happens through your classes, through your academic programming, through your social programming within your residences and the university programs. And so then the question was, okay, how do we challenge the language policy? And that's what Open Stellenbosch sought to do, was to challenge the language policy to make it so that Afrikaans is no longer the primary medium of instruction. It's no longer primarily used around the university, and that it's English is the primary, and then support in Afrikaans and any other languages as well, which is what it's become now.
Why was it a problem that at a so-called Afrikaans university, students were being taught in majority Afrikaans? Can you just explain that? Because a lot of people don't necessarily understand why that was a problem.
Yeah, well, historically, Stellenbosch was an Afrikaans university. But by 2015, the majority of students that were coming into that year, their home language was English. And so if you're attracting students through really incredible bursary incentives to bring them into a university where they can't understand, then you're excluding them. And if you're attracting students whose first languages aren't Afrikaans, then how are they expected to participate within the academic and social programmings of the university? And those are the big sort of questions. So Open Stellenbosch was quite small on Stellenbosch University's main campus. And so using art then became art, and really interesting methods of protest became ways to get the messages of Open Stellenbosch out there. So it was small things like stickers around the university campus that had I can't hear you or I can't breathe. And I can't hear you was in reference of the whisper translation devices which we used. So in classes where Afrikaans was used as the language of instruction, you would have whisper translation devices where someone would sit there with a microphone and translate what was happening in your class into your ears, but you couldn't hear what they were saying properly because you have your lecturer speaking. And they also aren't trained in the subject that you're being taught in. They're trained in translation. So small things like that. And then in 2016 and 2017, I worked quite closely with the curator, Greer Valley, on a residency and an exhibition, a series of exhibitions called Open Forum, which were to get students to reflect critically on, students and activists to reflect critically on the student protests of 2015 and 2016. So Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, Open Stellenbosch, all of it. And outsourcing as well, which is often still left out of conversations. And
I want us to come back to the idea of outsourcing, because it also speaks to class and how our economy is structured. But I want to take this conversation now to Velani. Velani, you were a student journalist and you decided you were going to be, what's sometimes known as an embedded journalist, and you were just going to tell the story of Fees Must Fall and the story of Rhodes Must Fall. What was that about, and how did that come about? And can you just share with the people like what happened there?
I want to first draw back to Funzani. What Funzani said, that there are universities which were considered, I don't know, they did not receive the attention that other universities did receive. It was the same with the media. There could be a protest at the CPUT, which is a stone throw away from UCT, and then the media will be non-existent there. There will be no one covering that protest. So I realized that the students this side do not have a voice. So we had to organize people from UCT to organize media for us. Imagine that even when our students were calling press conferences, no one came. And it speaks that to whiteness. Media is attracted to whiteness, and I can see that whiteness is attractive because even at VETS, big media houses were there. So what we did was that as a student journalism, I was a student journalist. I wanted to be part of Fees Must Fall, be there with the guys, protest, but I figured it out. It's not going to benefit the movement if I'm going to be there also. And so what I did is that since I'm doing journalism, and also now I have friends in the struggle, how about I write articles? I write from the students' perspective, where the students are going to be given a voice. Remember, universities have big PR monies. They can send out a statement which will be published by your big media houses without the students' comments. So now there's only a single narrative which is being published, which is being sent out to our parents who are at home. So now we as students had to come in and be like, decide, okay, guys, how do we counter this? And also, how do I not put myself where I'm going to be challenged? Okay, this guy says a journalist, but he's with the students. But also, our main media is with the universities, is with the establishment. So, which is something that we need to challenge. So, we also had something called, there was also Venek News, which was publishing from the student perspective. And me, I was also published with the Daily Sun News 24 at the time. So now we had this voice. We didn't have the voice only on social media. We also had it on the mainstream media. That it worked for us, because now after we published articles from the students' perspective, journalists now started calling, okay, when is the next meeting? When are you guys? Because they now realize that, okay, what we've been doing as journalists, it's wrong, because we've been publishing a one-sided view, and we're calling it
authoritative voices.
So, and in journalism, you're taught that you have to balance stories, you have to get both sides, and then you publish, but they were publishing only one. So that's when I came in, and then I'll join each and every process. I didn't join only CPUT. I was at UWC, I was at UCT, I was at CPUT too. My wish was that we could go to WUSU in the Eastern Cape. Those guys received no media, the media was not there. And on the groups we were speaking with other students, activists, they'll be like, man, don't you have someone who's on this side who can do what you're doing that side? Because they see that they are suffocating. No one is able to come and say, okay, guys, I'm here to listen to you. And remember, on the issue of universities not getting the same treatment, even on responses from the ministers, if UCT bans a bin,
Yes.
the minister will be there. CPUT bans a room, there's no one. So we still have that challenge here in South Africa where whiteness is still attractive and it's getting more attention than any other university. Yet we're called, okay, the universities are saying, okay, it's every university. And also CPUT, we must not call it a black university because what is happening there, it's the same that is happening at UCT. We do have black bodies, but the orders, the procedures, what is happening there, you can see it's anti-black. It's a university where we are not protected, we are not cared for. It's the same suffering that UCT students have. It's the same suffering that we have at CPUT, which are still happening now. So we have that issue here in South Africa, not only at universities, even and with the racism now, which is being sparked out in high schools. There's an issue there also. Do you see the media is doing the same mistake it did at Christmas for All? Do you see which schools are they attending to? The schools that they're ignoring, and also the narrative. When you are covering these issues, do not wait for social media. Okay, yes, maybe the issue will come out on social media, but after that, there's going to be that storm. That storm is going to die out. You as a journalist, you need to go down there, speak to students, learners who are from these schools, and also speak to past learners and see if, okay, is there a relationship between what they're saying right now and what this past student is saying right now? So I feel like the media is also failing to carry this discourse, because we as a media, we should be carrying the torch so that we can get people talking, but not carrying one side. We must not be on the side of the establishment. We must be on the side of the people.
Velani. So Velani, I'm sorry to cut you short, because you've just said a couple of things that I want to pick up on. So the struggle, I remember during Fees Must Fall, one of the things that used to be said, that unless and until the struggle is intersectional, it's not really the struggle that we should be in. And I want to bring in a couple of things. So I want us to talk a little bit about, some of the lessons that we can say we've learned from Fees Must Fall, we've learned from Roads Must Fall. And I want to bring myself in a little bit as well and talk about, as somebody who was part of decolonizing the curriculum and trying to participate as an academic during Fees Must Fall. And how, there were issues even from that side, and particularly the issues you're talking about, voices of authority, voices of power, and who was listening and who wasn't. So I want to talk to you guys particularly about, the class lens and the gender lens. Where were the voices of women? Where were the voices of trans people? Where were the voices of, people who are part of the LGBTQI community? And what do you think this current crop of leaders, this current crop of activists need to do to make sure that they don't make the mistakes that were made? Because there were some mistakes that were made around class, there were some mistakes that were made around who was represented and who wasn't. And I want to say outright that even now as we're speaking, part of the reason why people are online listening to me is because I happen to speak with this white accent, or this accent that is palpable and easy to understand for many people. And that's a big problem, because people should be able to speak and should be able to be heard in any accent and in any language that they choose to speak. And I just want to talk to that. So can you take us, Funzani, particularly women in Fees Must Fall? What were some of the issues, and how do we make sure that the next generation of activists do not make this mistake again?
To be quite honest, I actually think that Fees Must Fall had very powerful women. And I mean, I think of a lot of names now, and I'm like, wow, actually Fees Must Fall had women who were not afraid to challenge the status quo, and women who were not afraid to take up space, right? And I think that, I mean, at UJ was actually led by women, from all political parties, and some which were non-partisan. And I mean, we saw how, like how that gender discourse actually came across very strongly during those moments. But I think, again, it goes back to the fact that patriarchy still remains systematic, right? And it still remains a problem that is institutional, right? So it's very much almost like racism in how it operates itself, right? Women were still being oppressed in the way in which we were treated, we are treated in institutions. So I think that, I mean, there were moments in which women were taking up space, in that there were times where women would actually come to the forefront and say, but, you know, rape culture, number one, RU reference at Rhodes, for instance, right? Rape culture protests that happened throughout universities, you know, the GBV as well, the gender-based violence as well that happened. I think, to be quite honest, I feel that this generation of women have been very vocal and strong in those ways in challenging what, you know, like the structure that is of patriarchy. It's just also, obviously, it goes back to the fact that we still have to deal with the fact that these are the things that are actually institutionalized. And so how do we actually go about doing away with them, even when women have voices or when women are actually expressing in powerful ways that we have been. But you must also notice one thing, the way in which we understood gender from one university to the other was quite different. You know, historically, Black universities, when we are being real, we're not necessarily going into the gender discourse as perhaps more the elite kind of universities, your Wits and your UCTs. The reason for that is because the historically Black universities were struggling with the basics, right? I mean, there was a point in which we were all together at a national conference and we were talking about with people from different universities, University of Venda and whatnot, and we're talking about our experiences in all these institutions. And one of the comrades from University of Venda actually said, but we are struggling with getting computer labs, right? We are struggling with the most basic of things in our universities. And then you guys want us to have a conversation that is so almost far removed from the basic that we actually need in our own universities. So I think that's also one aspect that was missing. And when we usually reflect on the gender discourse, we don't actually put that across, that actually there were universities that were very much in the forefront when it comes to gender discourse, and that's because their space allowed them to be so concerned, to be, you know, and concerned in conceptualizing what gender discourse is and conceptualizing around queerness and whatnot. But there were other universities where that liberty.
It wasn't, I mean, I want to come in there, so I hear what you're saying. It wasn't necessarily a priority, not because it wasn't a priority, but because institutionally, resource-wise, it just wasn't a conversation that could happen. And again, I think it explains how, you know, from a social media perspective, audience members or people looking, we're thinking UCT people are really active because, well, they've got Twitter, they've got data, right? They've got computer labs where they can type these things out at, and they can actually have their voices be heard over and above the fact that because of class, their voices count, because of the kind of accents that they have, because of the kind of schools that they went to. Already people listen, already people are interested in hearing what they have to say. So Ntokozo, I want to come to you again and talk about, you know, this class issue. What are we talking about when you're talking about the issue of class in movements and in struggles? And why is it so important? And why is it such a big deal that we understand the importance of class? And I want to, you know, sort of lead you a little bit and talk about, you know, schools and the Afro and the fact that when it happens at private schools, we are so shocked and we are ready to write a policy. But when it happens at Black schools, nobody cares that, you know, Menir, who happens to be Black is saying your hair is dirty. In fact, your hair, Ntokozo, I think would be a problem at a Black school. Can you talk to us about that?
Thank you so much, Asanda. Yes, I mean, that's absolutely important. Look, I mean, I agree with you that the hair would be a problem. In fact, I intend for it to be a problem. That's exactly why I do it and why I move within white spaces with it. It's very, very important that we assert that this is how we are naturally as Black people, this is who we are, and these institutions belong to us, and we will own them through being ourselves. Now, there's a famous slogan that used to be said by comrades, by us during Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall. It was 1994 change, fuck all. And I think it's very important to use that as a point of departure. And the reason why I keep going back to the 1994 moment is that it can explain how, you know, a lot of these institutions where now all of the issues are flaring up, the issues that are flaring up are really symptoms of a broader system that has not been addressed while the government purports to represent to the people that these issues have been dealt with. And this
I wanna interrupt you just a little bit, Ntokozo. Just unpack for us, what does it mean to have political power and not economic power?
Yes.
Why is that important?
No, it's extremely important, Asanda, because I think it becomes very revealing when we look at different sides of power. You know, what happened in 1994 is that a black government or a black face really was put as being a face of a system that had not changed. And what people missed was that the struggle from the time of the first colonial encounter has always been about material things. It's always been about the land. It's always been about our resources. It's always been about our self-determination as an African people. It's never been really about only queuing after every 5 years and putting a paper in a box and then calling it democracy. So it is very important that we recognize that there are material issues that are involved when we are talking about a transfer of power and when we're talking about how a society is organized. So 1994 Change for Call, I think, is a very good diagnosis of the broader system that operates in the background to all of this. So then when we then see an issue flaring up in a white school about hair, right? We know that it's because that institution has remained a white bastion. It's remained a bastion of white power, and it hasn't changed. Now, in the black schools, I think it's very important what Ufunzani was saying earlier about the invisible hand of white supremacy that always plays in the background. Anti-black systems sometimes and often work through black agents. And this is why it is important to focus on systems, because systems tell us what on earth that is wrong with society structurally, regardless of whether or not or who the actual agent is, you know, who's actually pushing the agenda. So the black principal who says, your black hair, there's something wrong with it. The black principal is merely being a symptom of a broader system of anti-blackness that is in play, whether or not you are in a white space or whether or not you are in a so-called black space. All of these white and black spaces are all products of a colonial system. The special planning, the actual idea of a black university is an apartheid concept. So when people talk about, oh, it's so surprising that there are issues at the University of Zululand with white supremacy and anti-blackness, what they don't get is that these universities are products of a colonial order. They were built so as to continue facilitating the mass subjugation of black people, to give them inferior resources. It's not a coincidence, you know? And so—
Dogozo, sorry, I want to pause you there, comrade, just pause. We'll come back to you. I want to now go back to Emmanuel and say, you're hearing what's being said about gender, you're hearing what's being said about class. Are you guys thinking about, you know, what are the implications for gender? What are the implications for sexuality? What are the implications for language? And what are the implications for I want to focus particularly on class, because in the main, the people who have been attacked are white private schools, right? We're talking about you know, the wealth of this country. And I've been saying to, you know, some of the schools I've been talking to that this is not about you as an individual school. This is about institutionalized racism in society, which manifests itself in your school. So how are you, as the current crop of student activists, going to make sure that you are not just keeping this to private schools and the ways in which racism manifests itself, and that you are talking to also, you know, your former Model C schools, and also you are talking to black schools and young people, and the kind of issues that the young black people in black schools that are poor are facing. And also how, or are you even thinking about what is the role of the Department of Education, the Department of Basic Education, in this fight that you have started?
I think everyone is very right in saying that schools and universities are merely microcosms of, society. They're reflective of a broader issue. And so the issue of class is actually very pertinent to the institutional racism in all schools movement right now, because you're noticing that it's only white private schools that are getting the attention. And that's a problem because Ntokozo put it so well. There's this, invisible hand of whiteness that rests across all institutions. If you take a look at the code of conduct of, predominantly Black schools, you'll find that they are very, there are remnants of colonialism even in those schools' code of conduct, right? And so what becomes necessary then is the decolonial project. If we want to end racism at schools across the nation, whether they are predominantly Black schools or private schools, decolonialism is very pertinent to that happening. Another thing is that the Department of Education shouldn't only fix their eyes on predominantly white private schools or Model C schools, because then we'll find that a similar thing that happened during Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall will happen now. So we need to draw as much attention as possible to schools across the class spectrum. If not, we'll just see history repeating itself, and that's not what we want to see. So I think, like you said, the issue of class, very, very pertinent. Class, it manifests itself in many ways. A lot of schools, my previous school to be specific, have employed the services of a transformation consultant because they can afford it, But what happens to, to the school that is dealing with these issues and they can't afford it? What happens then? That's where the Department of Education needs to step in. What happens to students in these schools that are not heard? Because, there are platforms out there where people are sharing their stories, but the stories that get a lot of exposure are stories that happen in private white schools. What happens?
I wanna cut you off just a little bit because there's a very important, a challenge that I want to put out there, which is, what do you think? And I want all of you to sort of contribute to this one. What is the role of parents, and in particular Black parents? Because I feel like young people speak, and young people have been speaking. What are Black parents doing? What should Black parents be doing over and above just paying school fees for children to go to school? What do you think, parents should be doing? And I'm going to start with you, Emmanuel, and just give you a very short time, and then we're going to go to the other people who saw parents, not supporting them during Fees Must Fall. What is the role of parents in this current moment of school racism? What must Black parents do?
Yeah, I think very simply and very briefly, Black parents need to hear their kids. A lot of the times our Black parents have worked extremely hard to be able to afford us the opportunity to attend these schools. And even if we are there on scholarship, they work really hard to give us everything that they can so that we fit in, so that we don't feel excluded. So in many ways, when you go back home, let's say you're in boarding, you go back home on the weekend and you're telling them of everything wrong with the institution, the knee-jerk reaction is just be grateful you're there. And it makes sense, it makes sense. But the effects of that are so harmful, on Black students, on people of color. So I think very simply, the easiest thing and the most important thing that Black parents need to do is to hear their kids, hear their hearts, understand their sentiments, and walk that journey with them. Because you'll find that a lot of people of color leave high schools with serious mental health issues, inferiority complexes, and the likes, because they were not heard. And it's one thing to not be heard at your institution, but it's another thing not to be heard at home. So that's the one thing that I would suggest.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Rabia, I wanna bring you in now on two things. One, just to give your comment on what is the role of parents, but also just to challenge you a little bit and go into this people of color identity label. And is it a problem? Is it problematic? And if it is, why? And why are we continuing to talk of ourselves in these broken down ways? Why are we not using Black consciousness and talking of ourselves as Black? And is it important that we break ourselves down into colored, Black, Indian? And why is it important if it is important?
Well, that's a lot of very important questions.
I'm sorry.
So firstly, on the parents' question, I think I come from a very privileged place where my parents were very supportive of me and still are. And I think the ways that they were supportive were through listening, which is what Emmanuel said, but also through talking to their friends. And when their friends are not supportive of their kids, explaining to their friends why they must be supportive. And I think that's really useful, because while you can explain to your parents why they should be supporting you, if their friends also saying, like, listen to your kid, understand what your child's telling you. I think if there are parents who are watching now on the We Amplify, You Speak, We Amplify Instagram page, I've got the name completely butchered. They have
You Silence, We Amplify.
Yes, You Silence, We Amplify. That's it. Yes, yeah. Incredibly heart-wrenching stories that are coming out of like racism that students have experienced there. But they have a section on how parents can help their kids and what adults can do. And I think parents also need to hold the institutions that they're giving their money to accountable. You are paying them. So if you are paying them, they should be like making a safe environment. And now on the question of labels and identity, I think the phrase people of color has become so used in our speak and in the way that we talk to one another, because of the influence of Black Lives Matter and movements like that are from the US and in American media that are now coming into South African context. And I think it's important that we reassess those for ourselves. So looking at phrases like Black, Indigenous, people of color, what does that mean in South Africa? How do we make sense of that here? And I think it's really important for us to think of and I think post 94 and thinking of these fees must fall and post conversations of Black consciousness, how do we then also understand within Black as including colored and Indian, the differences, but also the similarities. So the similarities of an experience of white supremacy, but also the differences of that experience of white supremacy, which I think are really important. And also the anti-Blackness that happens within colored and Indian communities was really important to discuss and call out.
Yes, thank you so much. I think I want us now to as we gallop towards the end, I want us to focus on one thing, which is do you think that a decolonized curriculum is the answer? And if it is, how can we do this? And let's dream a little, because often we in the trenches, we're fighting, we're ready, we've got our art, we've got everything ready. If we were to dream, what does a decolonized curriculum look like? What does a Department of Basic Education that is in support of students fighting against racism look like? What does a Department of Higher Education that is in support of students fighting against racism look like? What does a South Africa that has Black political power that is in support of young people fighting against white supremacy look like? I know this is a lot, but it's important for us to sort of lay out these plans and to have these dreams so that the nation can see that, people are not just burning stuff and inflaming and defaming, etc., just there are reasons, and there are very specific reasons for that. I want to start with you, Velani. What are your thoughts on
that? Before answering that, I just want to also say that legislation alone won't solve our problems. We need to go back in history. We need to take teachers and actually make them see the history that we're talking about. Because if we're just going to put laws there, which people are just read as if they are reading the Constitution, so they won't adhere to them. Speaking about the decolonization, you see, I'm a journalist. Say if I was a doctor in a decolonized society, remember what we're in now, we are being treated as professionals, or being treated as commodities who consume other commodities. Because
Yes.
what's happening, the people with money are going to take my skill and say, hey, how much do you want? I'm going to say this much.
Yes.
They're going to take it away from my country, from my community.
Yes.
And then I'm going to go to the suburbs where there's an
Yes.
influx of skills, and I'm going to add my skills there.
Yes.
Yet
Yes.
here in Strand, there's a need for this skill. So in a decolonized society, I will be saying, hey, government, I'm a doctor, and I'm giving you my 5 days of the week for free.
Yes.
What I need from you is medicine, so that I can go and serve the people of Kailija for free, so that I can go and serve the people of Strand for free. And if I was an engineer, the bridges that we need in the Eastern Cape, there are people, there are black people with the skills, but they're waiting for the money because what the commodities, waiting to consume what the commodities. We're waiting for people to say, hey, how much do you want, so that we can fix the problem of Englobo, where the people can build bridges. But if we're decolonized, we're going to, we as blacks have come up, okay, we're going to design this bridge because people have been dying in this river. So what we need from you, government, is money so that we can make this possible. We're offering our skill. So that is what a decolonized society will look like. We practicing Ubuntu. Blacks have been practicing Ubuntu before white settlers came in, but now they changed us, our minds. And that colonialism changed our minds so that we can say, first give us money, then we act. So a decolonized society would be an influx of skills. We don't leave Kaelich, or we don't leave the townships. We're offering our skill to better improve our communities. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ntokozo. I wanna pick up on that, and this is the conversation that we've had privately that I wanna bring into this public forum, which is to say, what is the role and what is the responsibility of us as Black professionals, as Black people who are economically privileged, in these fights and in these, you know, in this decolonization and decolonized curriculum or decolonized way of thinking. Just picking up on what Velani has said, what are some of your
thoughts? So two things, Asanda, because I see we are running out of time. But so the one is that I think we definitely need to support the students on the ground. One of the things that we used to decry during Fees Must Fall was the absolute indignation that people had, people who were young professionals who had gone through the same universities, now seemingly just didn't understand why we were fighting when they've been through the same systems. But sometimes it's a result of trauma and all sorts of other things that people don't want to face. So I hope that we're better and we're able to support these kids. And I want to announce that in the different schools, because I'm seeing a lot of victimization, because these schools have now turned this entire anti-racist discourse that these young children are basically raising, and they've turned it into reputational issues. They've threatened people with defamation claims. There are all sorts of crazy things that are going on. The classic how not to respond. So I'm saying, please get in touch with us. Ntokozo,
yes, Black lawyers. Yes, thank you.
Please, we are there. Black lawyers played a very important role during Fees Must Fall. I mean, I remember the likes of Sisluleka Flatela, who played very, very important roles in terms of releasing students, representing them, making sure that they're not bullied by institutions. So we are available to our legal friends who are listening. Put yourself up, put your services up. The way to contribute as a professional.
Contact Ntokozo. Contact Ntokozo.
Use your skill, and defend the movement, defend, our rights as Black people to express ourselves and our rights to be human, at the end of the day.
Yeah. Okay, Emmanuel, I wanna throw to you and say, we've had this, very interesting conversation that we're wrapping up now. What are your thoughts? What are your fresh and emerging thoughts based on the conversation that you've had, and how do you think this latest movement that we have now all committed to? I mean, you've got some legal eagles there by Mr. Kwabe and friends who have said they are behind you. How do you think that empowers you to go forward, and how do you think that's going to change the way in which you're going to fight this?
Yeah, I think definitely hearing what Ntokozo said is just very encouraging. I think all throughout the time that, we've started this movement towards ending racism at schools across the country, I've just been overwhelmed at such a show of support. So we've had many people who work in transformation, many law students who have availed themselves to say, hey, look, we can help you out. And so I'm very hopeful for the future. I think this conversation has been very enlightening, very eye-opening. You know, we're always told by our parents that what an adult sees sitting down, you know, a kid can't see, even standing on the tallest tree. So that's the attitude that I've come in with. I've learned a lot. And yeah, I've learned the importance of intersectionality in the movement. So that's definitely something I'll be taking moving forward.
Okay, thank you so much to all of you guys. I'm really so proud of all of you because I know all of you personally, and I look forward to many conversations. I think that the young people and the young students know that we are here and we are supporting them. And I want any and everybody who's interested in the Decolonial Project to get in touch with any of the people on this panel, whether it's on Facebook or any platform. I know that we will all answer. And I want to thank, SABC for giving us this platform and for just extending the opportunity for us to talk to all the different people that we want to talk to, that want to understand what it is that young people want and what it is that young people look forward to. Because I personally don't want to have this conversation next year talking to the latest group of activists that are now trying to fight for and trying to fight against this very same thing. Thank you so much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was Sanda Ngasheng, the moderator of that special panel for you tonight. And if you missed it, it will be on sabcnews.com. We live streamed it there as well. All right, we take a short break on The Full View. I'll be back at